It's a pleasure to see you again. And today we're going to talk in general about the representation of leadership in films and movies to get into the particulars of Godfather Part III and The Last Dawn, one of the last novels by Mario Puzo before his death. The key point is the following. We've seen a group of films where there was clearly a moralistic view of the gangster, whereby the protagonist had to be killed, had to pay the price for their criminal activities, because that was the correct thing for the film as a vehicle that conveys a message to an audience, but also for the story itself. When we moved to The Godfather, we found a different approach to the representation of mafiosi and mafia leaders. Something that looked positive, that combined a professional view of the mafia don as a planner, as a thinker, as a strategist, as someone who, as much as possible, delegates violence, because violence is not in their courts, it's not something that matches a core element of their personality. And we also found films that emphasize the necessity for their involvement in criminal activities, justified by the need to protect members of their family in general, their mafia family as a group of people who depend on the leader, whose destinies are tied to the leader. And yet, through the trilogy, we see an increased emphasis on the negativity, on the negative consequences of this model of leadership that mixes fatherhood and the leadership of a criminal group, of a chapter of criminal organization. So, why is that the case? Is it something that has to do with their strategies or their set of values? And the first thing that I want to do is go back, in order to answer this question, is go back to Machiavelli. Because we can ask ourselves, is Machiavelli's ideal prince faring any better? Is the ideal leader of Machiavelli any more successful, any happier? Is there something that we're missing, that we're not getting from Machiavelli because we don't see it in the book? Or is there something that Machiavelli himself is hiding? So, the first slide of this presentation, based on notes that you find under week 10, a page I posted this morning, focuses on the prince, and if you want to give it a name, that name would be Cesare Borgia, because Machiavelli himself said, I couldn't propose any better model for my times than Cesare Borgia. And then, of course, Vito and Michael Corleone. Let's talk about the possibility that Machiavelli is hiding something. Because clearly, we can also see, if you read The Prince, even if you read The Prince in its entirety, the system that Machiavelli is promising its reader, especially the qualified readers, right, who are the high echelon of the Medici family or other possible top leaders in Italy who might be inspired by this book to hire Machiavelli to engage his advice, his consultancy to further their agenda. Even if you read all of it, you find that it's not terribly clear what Machiavelli means. There are all the chapters are there to suggest some strategies, specific elements, but how do they come together? How do they function together? In fact, you can think of Machiavelli's book the same way you should be thinking about the models by Leonardo da Vinci. You know that Leonardo da Vinci has been celebrated, especially between the end of the 19th century and the end of the 20th century, as the inventor of everything, right? The inventor of the helicopter, of the machine gun, of the automobile, allegedly of the bicycle, etc. Yet, when you go and visit a museum and you find a wonderful model, and sometimes you can even buy a kit, for example, for the automobile, there used to be a kit that you could buy, a box with all the pieces, and you would put together this automobile and have it run briefly. It could not advance too long. When those models are realized, we know from the people who work on the models for the museums that more is needed than just the notebooks from Leonardo where you find the blueprints for those inventions. There are two issues with Leonardo's drawings. One, they're incomplete. For example, the so-called automobile, which in fact was just a theatrical prop, is missing the driving apparatus, or parts of the driving apparatus. And other times it seems like there are mistakes, and we can speculate that Leonardo wanted to hide things because he didn't want people to copy him. And when we know from his own notes that he had this paranoia that people would steal inventions from him. So the mistakes would have been ways to distract and mislead these thefts of intellectual property, and the missing parts would have been parts that were in his mind that he would have been able to add. So is there something in Machiavelli of this sort whereby Machiavelli knew how all the parts came together but didn't put it in the book because otherwise nobody would have to hire him to provide guidance? Let's talk about this. But if we talk about hiding something in the prints, then we need to go back to tradition. And within a century from Machiavelli's death in 1527, followed by the posthumous publication of the prints, already there were scholars and intellectuals who claimed that Machiavelli was not really direct and sincere in the pages of the prints. That the prints was just a satire, not an essay to help the prince, not a manual, a set of guidelines directed to aristocratic leaders, oligarchs, politicians, but rather a book directed to the wider audience of their subjects, where the subjects would be able to see the real face of power. So the word satire was used for some of those interpretations, and we can call it an ironic portrayal in that we use irony to say something and while we mean the opposite, okay? Something that is especially common in Italian culture, especially common in Tuscan culture, right? I can think of people from my West village, a man who was nicknamed Blonde, Biondo. People would address him that way, and of course he was not blonde.
Black hair, dark hair.
Nope. It wouldn't be funny, right? He was bald. Oh. He was bald. Okay. So is this just a way to unmask the real dealings of power at the top level? And this tradition, for this interpretation, goes all the way to our era. At the beginning of the 19th century, You have the Foscolo, famous Italian poet, who, while describing the tomb of and the sepulchral monument of Machiavelli in the Florentine church of Santa Croce, talks about blood and tears, says that Machiavelli has revealed that there is blood on the hands of leaders, and tears are the consequences of their decisions, that they make people suffer. But even more recently, just a few years ago, there was a book by an American scholar claiming that Machiavelli is pretending to give directions to leaders just to show people how pragmatic, cynical, and evil leaders need to be if they want to succeed. I don't believe in this interpretation, and if you look at chapter 25 and 26 of The Prince, you really see the deep motivation of Machiavelli, which was to bring change to the context in which he lived, the city of Florence, and the larger context of Italy during his time. And if anything remains hidden, is the fact that Machiavelli is a master persuader, that is manipulating potential leaders into believing that they can become successful using his system, hiding from them what the impact would be on their own career and their own human well-being, to the advantage of Florentine society, Italian society, because Machiavelli believes strongly that Italy needs a leader who will spare no attempts and no solutions to find a timely alternative to the current military and political crisis. So Machiavelli has to convince this leader that it is possible and has to hide the potential negative consequences for the leader as such, right? And in fact, we know that his model Prince Cesare Borgia ended his career in Italy in a bad way, being arrested, then deported to Spain, where he died a few years later, never having been recovered from the failure of his attempt to become a strong leader in Italy. So, what is Machiavelli alluded to? And in a way, we can call this the illusion of leadership, right? It's a necessary illusion for Machiavelli, because what is motivating the leader to become leader in the Machiavellian system? Since the Machiavellian system is not predicated on the satisfaction of the leader's whims, right? In Machiavellian terms, even the tyrant is subject to guidelines, right? Have to follow practices and procedures to stay in power. So it's a lot of work with limited satisfaction, right? So who's benefited from this system that Machiavelli came up with? And then we can try and apply this to Vito and Michael and try to understand the significance of their respective failures in their stories, right, as characters. So by applying Machiavellian laws, the leader certainly becomes more powerful and more respected. But as I said, this power needs to be deployed politically, not at the individual level, right? Machiavelli is not saying you can use this for the advancement of the goals of an individual. It doesn't work. It's not supposed to work that way, right? And respect, we know already, is not love, right? And that resonates with us, having seen so many of these films. We can call the successful leader someone who's, by virtue of their success, more serene, meaning that they have less to worry about their present or future situation if they've established a Machiavellian system of power. But no references to happiness, right? The prince is not happier. In fact, the opposite can be found as implied in the text. We know, even within The Prince by Machiavelli, that there is no escaping solitude for the prince. The prince cannot share secrets because that would weaken. The prince needs to have collaborator, but there is a lot of stuff that the prince cannot share with anyone. And in the films we've seen that, right? The chief example would be Sonny manhandling the poor Calogero because he cannot trust the only person who was like a son to him, not just a friend. And he has to admit, I cannot trust anyone, because if I did, then I would not be secure, right? According to this system. Interestingly, even though the prince of Machiavelli should not be restrained or inhibited by moral considerations, moral condemnation can still be the end result of his political actions. That is to say, Machiavelli is saying, follow this advice and you'll be successful politically. But it's not saying you'll be successful and people will think you were a good person. No, it's saying that you have to sacrifice, you might be honest, sincere, you might believe in a system and in a set of values that people can support, but you will find it necessary at some point to deviate from the good moral practices. You'll have to do it, you'll have to sacrifice your soul for the benefit of the community and the state. So, moral condemnation by posterity is a given in many circumstances, and we have a good example with Cesare Borgia, who traditionally is considered a monster, was considered a monster during that time, and was, even though he was very successful politically and militarily. Or you cannot, for the same reasons, escape hell. If there is hell, you'll end up there. Probably Machiavelli was an atheist, but or was agnostic, or someone who did not believe or disbelieve in God and hell, but there is also that possibility, and there is no escaping, right? The prince himself is not invulnerable to fear, to the effects of fear, right? Machiavelli's concern with hatred is supported by his knowledge of history, and there are a few references to that. So there is always the possibility of revenge, right? Machiavelli himself confirms that the prince can be secure, or rather more secure, following his advice, but cannot be completely secure. Especially if you have a single individual who's committed, motivated, is trying to kill the prince will have to be in public places, right? You cannot cultivate a positive image without being seen in public places, so you're always exposed to the revenge. The same way, we go back to Sonny being killed by the son of the guy that was holding the baseball bat to beat Joe Pesci, and Sonny is in this bar celebrating, and he gets killed in spite of his bodyguards, escort, etc., right? Because that's how Sonny's leadership is projected onto the community, right? There are moments when he's surrounded by people. People have to feel confident right? And if they always thought of Sonny as a possible target, isolated from the rest, then their confidence would be limited. So, for these and other reasons, even Machiavelli's prince is not completely happy, satisfied, that is not living a fulfilling life. Who else is benefiting, and possibly who was Machiavelli thinking about for the greater good of his Machiavellian strategies? The citizens are benefiting, but in ways that are different from what we might think. When Machiavelli thinks of the citizens benefiting from a successful prince as individuals within their context, especially their context of business, not their family, we're not talking again about citizens living a fulfilling life. Rather, it goes back to Machiavelli's pessimistic view of humanity and their human nature. Machiavelli says, human nature is imperfect, humans by nature are sinful, are terrible people, they're crafty, they are often naturally inclined to cheat to get whatever they want, but society would descend into chaos if everyone behaved like that. So the prince has a political necessity attached to his own use of deceit or force. However, the powerful and positive side effects of this is that a powerful prince, a strong leader, can enforce boundaries. People will be afraid of the consequences if they violate the laws, and therefore they'll become better. And it's not just the spreading of hypocritical behavior. You have to combine this view. People by nature are for the most part bad. They need a strong leader to make them behave better. You have to combine this view, this concept, with Machiavelli's belief in Aristotelian ethics. Because the famous philosopher Aristotle was, when it came to ethics, a behaviorist. You know, in psychology, I don't know if you've heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. Since the 1950s, there is a branch of psychology saying, behave the way you want to become or be. And sooner, so if you were anxious, try to act as if you were not anxious, etc. So the idea in Aristotle and in modern behavioral therapy is you become what you do. If you act in a certain way day after day, then you slowly turn into that model for the behavior. So if you're forced to be as honest as possible by a strong leader who enforces laws and social rules, social norms, then after months, years of doing that, being honest will be your second nature. Okay? And so the whole of society will benefit from it. So, of course, Machiavelli had a very top-down view of society, right? The masses are like sheep, they're gregarious, they're followers. So they need a strong leader. They cannot rise to the top or rise to the level of mature citizens, if not under special circumstances. The Romans were such mature citizens at some point in their history, but for a brief moment of time, and then they descended into chaos even more. And who's benefiting the most from the personal and moral sacrifice of the leader? The country of Italy. So Machiavelli wants to convince a leader that it's worth applying his rules, knowing that even if they fail in the long term, Italy would benefit if they at least are able to eradicate from Italy the foreign influences. If they're able to free Italy from the armies of France, Spain, the German Empire, right? And then even if their government comes to an end, that would be a great result worth achieving. And therefore, yes, we can say Machiavelli is omitting something. Machiavelli is hiding the dark consequences of his model leadership. What are, let's review with this in mind, what are the key elements of his advice, keeping in mind also the behavior of Mario Puzo's leaders in film and novels. There are two axioms that are foundational, but that I put in parentheses because they're not expressed clearly, directly. They're implied in multiple passages. One axiom is that success, political success, leadership, is predicated upon the availability of resources, right? To be strong, you need military, police forces. Those are expensive. Modern warfare is expensive because you need cannons and other weapons, flamethrowers, rifles, handguns, and the likes. So you cannot be a strong leader without a strong society, making resources available. And the second axiom, which is connected to the other, is that in modern society, unlike the Middle Ages, where you may have or imagine a castle with a feudal lord controlling the countryside around the castle, you have a small community, right? And the castle and a small amount of troops, mobile troops, other knights, are sufficient to control that community and that area. You have larger communities, larger territories, organized differently, so you cannot just use force, you need influence to control a larger number of subjects. And you need to influence them because they need to be not forced to work, they need to collaborate to the social project, because they need to be fully committed to working long hours, right? That's the idea of capitalism, to grow their companies, grow the economy, grow society in general. Without economic growth, there are fewer resources available. Without resources, you can be a brilliant strategist, but you'll fail, right? That's Machiavelli's ideas, and that's where influence comes into playing in a big way, right? And that's how even the most powerful leader is conditioned by the reaction of the subjects. And this gets a bit forgotten in the Godfather trilogy, especially Part 2 and Part 3. What are Machiavelli's directives, the laws to the prince? Be efficient, which means use indirect forms of power whenever possible, right? Because they're cost effective. You're not exposing your organization to the attention of the authorities or the repercussions. Use violence only when necessary, right? And Michael and Vito will certainly do that, although, as I suggested already, influence is not at the top in Michael's priority, or perhaps is not in his nature. Vito, played by Marlon Brando, behaves differently in a more jovial way, but Michael is so stern, right? You need to, in Machiavelli, build and protect your public image. That's essential. Without that, there is no influence that would be positive. So you have to use simulation and dissimulation. You have to pretend to be good. That would be simulation. Is Michael pretending to be a good husband and father? Not as much as Vito, apparently. Dissimulation, meaning you have to hide your true nature, right? You cannot have your mother, your wife, your kids know that you are also a very violent leader responsible for blood and tears, right? And you can also achieve that by manipulating information, saying false things, or be selective about the sharing of information. The other key aspect of Machiavelli is, if you want to have society follow you as a leader, you need to enforce rules in society. That's the negative. Reward good practices. That's the positive. Reward the citizens who are more committed to the growth of society. And in general, persuade people to become better, right? So you're not forcing them to be better, but you're creating the context, the circumstances for their individual betterment. You have to consider society as a dynamic system, which is always changing in a positive or negative way, and you have to move with the processes. You have to influence society as things are happening, or your group as things are happening, right? Because otherwise it would be too late to apply a solution if you just wait. But it's especially important to keep the last bullet point in mind in the case of Michael, because is Michael following this advice? Is he trying to increase confidence within his family and his group? Because confidence means compliance, voluntary compliance, which means that in critical moments, without even asking, people will support you. Is Michael doing that? And hope for the future. Clearly, in Machiavelli's view of society, if people have no hopes, then they will not commit their resources, their time, and their money, their material resources and their immaterial resources to growth, right? Machiavelli has the merchants, the Florentine merchants in mind, not the workers, right? The workers in the manufacturing businesses of Florence are exploited, right? They're forced to work 12 hours a day, and certainly they try to escape that system. But the merchant is someone who's working at least 12 hours a day or more, because they're fully committed and they have put their money into their company. But if they have no confidence in the leader and they have no hope for the future, then they'll say, I'll move my money or my business somewhere else. I'm being historic. I'm not being facetious or commenting on the present situation. Or they will put their money in the bank, not invest their money, not spend long hours trying to grow their business, right? They'll wait because they say, well, if I do all this, all my sacrifices will be lost because our leader is not able to protect this community, okay? And from this point of view, what I see personally is that Michael is making limited efforts to build confidence and hope around him, right? He's hanging by a thread always, but not trying to even pretend that there is hope when there isn't, right? Which should be the case for Machiavelli, right? It doesn't matter if there is no hope. People have to think there is hope. Otherwise, of course, you'll fail. Okay, so let's go back to the Godfather. And the first thing is that these characters are characters in a story. So what works, what makes the Godfather the best in the trilogy? What makes the Godfather Part II still work? And what makes the Godfather Part III a partial success at best, or the worst film in the series, or a failure, depending on your point of view? You have to, in my view, you have to see the Godfather Part III twice at least to appreciate how bad it is, and 3 times to see that there are some parts that are good, in spite of everything. Now, the best thing about The Godfather is that it is a classic story of transformation, right? Where you have a protagonist, Michael, who's a military hero, college graduate, engaged with a wonderful woman, on their way to establishing their lives in American society and live the American dream. And then he's thrown into this maelstrom, into this stormy situation where he has to protect his father, protect his family, become a criminal, become the criminal leader of his mafia family, right? So, at the basis of great stories, you have this powerful transformation that changes the character completely in a positive or a negative way. Godfather Part II, what is the story really about? We know that the story is different. The focal point of the story is, will Michael be able to turn his family into a legitimate family so that he can become just a father and a husband and a businessman? And on its way to reaching that goal, what will be the costs to pay, the sacrifices? And who will benefit, right? And the tragedy in Part 2 is that no one is there when Michael has resolved all his issues affecting the stability of his leadership. No one is there to enjoy the benefits, right? He's completely alone. Yet, in Machiavellian terms, the message in Godfather 2, both for Vito, young Vito Andolini, and Michael Corleone, is once you find yourself in a game impacted by criminals, then you need to keep playing the game to the end. You cannot extricate yourself from the game. And therefore, Mike is forced to continue to be bad, even when that is taken from him, his family, that should be those who benefit from this game. Right? The other thing about Godfather 2, and in general about Michael, you might say, is that Vito is believable both as a father and as a criminal leader. Michael initially is very believable as a fiancé, but becomes less and less believable as a husband and as a father, because his nature comes out more strongly as a dark leader, right? That's where you find his talents. Godfather 3 tries to imitate the other two, right? The first one started with a marriage, the second with a communion, the third starts with another celebration. This time is Michael himself, who has been knighted by the pontiff, by the pope, with this illustrious title bestowed on him. But when we saw the marriage, we perceived happiness. The sequence of the marriage was lively, right? And colorful. The communion was a bit more cold. It was more of a public event, not a lot of joy. The ceremony to celebrate the knighting of Michael is perfunctory for the most part. There are some moments between him and his daughter, Mary, but not much joy comes out. Immediately you have this tragic atmosphere. The Corleone are like a royal family. Michael is like the king, and his kids are like the members of a royal family, meaning they cannot have a regular life because their father is the king, so to speak. And the tragedy for the story of Michael is that at this point it's clear that it was all for nothing. Nothing, because if your dream is to become legitimate and then you find out that there is no legitimacy in regular society, that you cannot abandon your armed forces, you cannot just become a citizen, because you'll be exposed to the evil that is built into society, meaning you'll become the target by those, the powerful, the politicians, the wealthy, the affluent,
the church, all those that represent corrupt sections of society. So nobody can survive in regular society, be happy, be protected, etc. Corruption is everywhere. So you're better off having criminal protection, right? Having armed criminals around you. If you surrender your organization, then you just become a little guy playing with bigger and more powerful players, right? So it doesn't work. That's the first part of Michael's necessary failure, unavoidable failure. And the other part of it is that, as far as the family, there are no happy families, there are no happy relationships. So if you're doing it to have a happy relationship with your partner and a happy family to grow together, there is no such a thing. So are your sacrifices moral and physical worth? No, they're not. What are the alternatives that Michael seeks in Godfather Part III? The absolution for his sins. He will confess to Cardinal Lamberto, go through a powerful confession, beautiful scene, where Michael will say, I killed my father's son, I killed my brother, Fredo, and I was responsible for the murder, for the death of many other people, right? So, and it seems like he's at least in part sincere. He's trying to redeem himself as a father, trying to help Anthony become a singer, opera singer, trying to guide Mary through life away from Vincent, away from Andy Garcia's character, who will become the next Godfather. So Michael, in regard to Mary, yes, he's officially on the surface worried about incest, but really more worried about Mary becoming the wife of an evil guy. And is seeking forgiveness from Kay, and there is some reconciliation there that is then dissolved by the death of Mary, right? You know that Mary will be killed when a killer will try to kill Michael and a bullet will reach Mary in the chest. And in general, the film is very much about getting through old age. It's all about Michael, Al Pacino, becoming older, right? And leaving a legacy. The end of Michael is years spent contemplating what he did. So that's also a kind of penance and redemption. And you know that the original Godfather had Michael die, falling from the chair outside of a Sicilian villa. The Godfather coda that was re-edited by Coppola a few years ago has Michael just on the chair, alone, thinking about the past. There are Machiavellian moments in Godfather Part III. The violence is always the result of a state of necessity. Same with the scheming, right? Michael has to go back to scheming because when he gets involved with the affairs of the church, he finds that the church is worse than mafia. Politics is like mafia. There is this idea that you find in the novels, the late novels by Puzo, this idea that the mafiosi are essential to society, not because they're criminal. Crime is secondary to their mission. Their mission is to provide essential services when it comes to control. Whenever someone loses control of a situation and they have no recourse or limited recourse to the state, or the state, the government, is not able to restore justice, bring back control in that situation, where do you go? You go to the mafia. And this is historically correct, right? The best Machiavellian moment could be this one, but it's open to interpretation, when Michael confesses to Cardinal Lamberto that he has blood on his hands. Is he completely sincere? Is it just a very raw moment? Or is he trying to manipulate Cardinal Lamberto, or both? Because interestingly, Cardinal Lamberto will become Pope, and you would think when he becomes Pope, that's the end for Michael. Lamberto will not, once he becomes John Paul I, will not authorize Michael to operate on behalf of the church, to manage the affairs of the church, because now he knows through the secret of confession that Michael is evil. And instead, Lamberto approves of Michael's role, gives the approval, gives the go-ahead, possibly because Lamberto knows that he's a sinner who is remorseful, or at least suffering for his sins. Okay, so beautiful moment, which could be Machiavellian. So what do we find instead in The Last Dawn, published in 1996? It's a story of a family, the Clericuzio, from 1965 to the 1990s. Starts with a family ceremony, which is also a public social event, the christening of 2 babies in the family, with all the usual elements. The whole family is gathering, they're celebrating, there are some outsiders, a picture is taken, like in every film, including The Godfather 3. It's a family in the mafia and in the natural biological sense, right? A blood family and a crime family together. And it's a classic story, like the story of a royal family where the Don, the last Don, Domenico Clericuzio, is like a king with a kingdom, and he has to prepare his succession. Their kingdom is very specific. It's an enclave in the Bronx of about 40 blocks, where they have absolute control. The leader is reminiscent of Vito. He's benign, jovial, but also skillful, and of course he has a particular set of skills. He possesses intelligence, he's a strategist, but also ferocity. He's still someone who can use violence. There is the combination of intelligence and ferocity you can call strength, in the words of the author. In the initial scene, it's like Puzo plagiarizing himself, right? It's Puzo going back to his ideas and saying, I should have made more money out of these ideas, let me rehash the same elements, let me use the formula to make more money. There is, in this initial sequence, the outside, people celebrating, and the inside, this windowless study office called the Den, with a long conference table where 10 mafia heads will sit down together to plan the future. And Don Clericuzio is planning the future of his family with goals in mind, such as increasing their safety and the stability of the family. What concerns him in 1965, violent criminal power is too dangerous because it's too conspicuous. If we continue to act as criminals, it's only a matter of time before the government will come crashing on us. Okay? So that's his immediate needs. And then we have the plans for every member of the family. This is where the writing in this book becomes less interesting than The Godfather, because it's kind of formulaic, going through the list. So, Giorgio, who is the oldest son of Clericuzio, will get an MBA from Wharton and will learn how to steal lawfully, right? Legally. He's destined to be the Don's successor once the family transitions to the legitimate world, which will happen in 20-25 years. Pippi is the Don's nephew, and he's a true natural leader, called the hero general, someone who's even physically imposing, tall, strong, but charismatic, has natural influence, can be brutal, violent, can be charming, seductive in a social sense. He is sent to Las Vegas, where he'll handle the hotel business of the family. Specifically, he'll handle the collection agency. When people owe money to the casinos, he has to recover that money. And he will also be, whenever needed, the family hammer, meaning the Luca Brasi, meaning the one who does these special murders, the difficult murders. This assignment is part of the Don's manipulation. He wants Pippi away from New York City, from the Bronx, because otherwise Giorgio's leadership would suffer. Because as far as qualities, Pippi should be the leader. Pippi is violent in nature, but able to put people at ease. It means he's a perfect Machiavellian model, because Machiavelli's presumption is that the best leader is someone who has a switch, who can become violent only when needed by turning the switch, but otherwise be seen as sociable, not a psychopath, right? He marries for love, and that's a form of relinquishing control, so he makes that mistake. There is another son of the Don who's small and soft-hearted like Fredo. His objective is to open a restaurant. There is another son, Pitti, who's a natural-born assassin, so errs on the side of violence, not a big brain. He is given control of the Bronx enclave. He's called the mayor of that. But it's like a feudal system. The Don is saying, I give you this land, you can do whatever you want, as long as you keep order inside, and you're able to provide money and soldiers when I ask for it, which is exactly what a medieval king would ask of a baron or a marquis or a duke when they were entrusted with the control, the jurisdiction over a territory. The Clericuzio family, how is it transitioning towards a legitimate world, stepping in the legitimate world? They'll abandon crime for the most part, and they'll offer services to other mafia families. This is Mario Puzo's idea of mafia as a corporation. They'll do money laundering for the other families. They'll invest the profits of the crimes for a fee. And they'll get themselves involved in the following business. And this also reflects Mario Puzo's personal skewed view of these kinds of businesses. Mario Puzo believed that hotels were essentially scammy operations. That when you go to a hotel as a customer, you're being scammed all the time. You're overpaying for services. So he thought it fitting that a mafia family should get involved with hotels, because it's another part of society that it's legal, but cheating customers all the time. Banking, same rationale. Banks are serving customers and cheating them off of their profits, right? You give money to the bank gives you back your money at 7% interest rate. Gambling is the only form of criminal activities that is acceptable, and in time it will be legalized. He also offers what Vito had in the Godfather Part I, access to political connections and judges, the police, etc. You find in here the same concept I explained before, mafia as a service industry. The mafia offers solutions to true needs, meaning when the government cannot give you a solution now and here, right now and right here, then the only person who can get you out of trouble is a mafioso. And you pay a price, right? Which could be exchanging services or paying money. Don Clericuzio believes they still need an army because regular society is full of vultures. So if they have money, people will try to get their money, so they need forceful protection of that. And the family is destined to disappear, right, into the lawful world with the awareness that the leader or leaders will have to pay a price. They'll sacrifice themselves for the family. So they're like the Machiavellian prince, who's not the happiest or the one who benefits the most from his behavior. Others will have a happier life, right? In this case, it's these two babies. They imagine the two babies will be happier, but the leaders will pay a personal and a moral price. However, the whole thing is impossible because human nature is evil, and therefore there is no stability. There is no lawful world where you are protected, entirely safe, where your family is entirely safe, right? So there is a Machiavellian negative view of humanities. In the excerpts, the pages I posted, they offer you the history of the family, of the Puzo family. They go back to the history of the family in Sicily, and this idea that Sicily is an ancestral land where ferocity is a staple, right? Where you find natural inclination to ferocity. They start this section with the story of Don Pietro. Don Pietro is an enemy of the Clericuzio. But after a long war, Don Pietro is about to die because he's old and had a stroke. So he only has days to live. The Clericuzio sent a killer to kill him because they need to have him killed before he dies naturally, right? He cannot have a peaceful death. That's the exemplification of ferocity. And you might say, this is completely unnecessary, but however, you then tell this as a story and you reinforce the myths, the reputation, the influence of the family through storytelling, right? Of course, they acknowledge that ferocity, violence, has to be used in a Machiavellian way. It's a costly weapon, should not be wasted, should have justification, should be used selectively. They acknowledge, the narration acknowledged that Mussolini was the only one with his fascist government coming close to eradicating the mafia from Sicily, simply because they acted in a dictatorial way, not following the laws. And that's how they played the same game with the mafia. That's how they came close to winning. Domenico, to escape persecution by the fascists, is sent to the US, where, being a natural leader, he establishes his own criminal empire. Especially because, and this is another fixation in Mario Puzo's mind, American society, modern American society is weak, it's soft. If you look at the justice system, it's all based on the Roman principle, in dubio pro reo. When in doubt, decide in favor of the person who is accused of a crime, right? It's better for 100 criminals to go free than one innocent person to go to jail. That was the traditional system. But in Mario Puzo's conservative view of society, that's bad, that's softness. And American society is soft because through the years, they legalized gambling, and Mario Puzo loved gambling. He was a big gambler. But he also thought that it was bad for society in general because people will ruin themselves. And so by legalizing gambling, the government is like a bad father, allowing their kids to ruin their lives with their hands, not protecting them, right? And the other thing that Puzo criticized and put in the book is that, yeah, in America, you can buy friendships with money. You can always buy a politician or a judge. They're very easy to buy, and this makes this society vulnerable, right? The goals of the Last Dawn are the American dream, provide wealth and power to the family, to gain respectability, right? Because you may be rich, but you need other people to recognize that you have dignity in society. Provide security and protection to the family. All of this by the only natural leader in the story is defined a romantic dream, right? And this is, in Michael's story as well, a romantic dream, meaning Michael seems to be very pragmatic, but then believes in this romantic utopia of the legitimacy of his family business and the whole life of the family. A lot of elements from the culture of southern Italy are brought into this book. The idea that mafia operates like a feudal system. A feudal system is one where instead of organizing society, you have a king, an emperor, who says, I cannot govern over everything. So I'll give you control of Long Island, I'll give you control of Texas, and then you can do whatever you want as long as you maintain order and as long as you grow that territory so that you can provide money and resources. And the system of values, the hierarchy of values of the characters in the story is very much southern Italia. You need to be loyal to the family first, right? Blood is blood. Second comes God, and this might be surprising because of course these criminals are not following God's laws. However, this is the God of the Catholics, right? A God you can reshape to your liking. That's the idea. And in fact, a lot of criminals, even in the 19th century, not just today, have been found with images of saints in their pockets, have been found trying to pay money to priests to get a solution. So, yes, they were criminals, but they still wanted to be friends with God. That was part of their culture, right? It was part of a value system together with the concept of honor, for example. Third comes loyalty to subjects. But subjects are not just the people who are served by the mafia, also those who are protected. So, in other terms, it's the clan, the people that exists within the circle of the Godfather. Finally, society in general, meaning you cannot act in a way that is flaunting social norms. You have to keep appearances. Government, not in this list, because in the traditional culture of southern Italy, the government is other. It's a foreign government, it's a rapacious government, it's an unjust government. So the last level, the last group of people you trust in society are members of the government. You don't. And the whole thing is about trying to escape poverty, right? You see numbers of people, large numbers of people that are helpless, and you're trying to get to the top. So that reflects the view of southern societies in the past. And then there are, in the excerpts that I included, a few exemplary episodes that are based on Machiavellian in many ways. For example, Danny Fuberta is someone who takes rich people from New York City to Las Vegas, where they'll be comped with free hotel rooms, free meals, and they'll spend a few days gambling and lose their money, right? So it's just putting together groups, convincing people to have a good time in Las Vegas, people who have money to spend on gambling. Fuberta tries to cheat the system by bringing in scammers who run huge bills in Las Vegas and don't gamble, don't lose money. So has to be punished. And the punishment is murder, has to be killed. But they go through a process, right? They assess the ratio between costs and benefits. Is it worth the risk, right? Because killing someone means exposing oneself to being arrested, being prosecuted. And they adopt a practical view. If we kill him, we don't get any money back. Can we get some money back before we kill him? So they tell him, okay, we'll let you go, just give us back at least 100,000 now and 300 later, and you'll be fine. But then he understands that it's just a ruse, goes into hiding, and then later on is found and killed, exiting a restaurant in the Upper West Side. There is careful planning, right? This is the description of the killer, Pippi. Not just some rampaging gorilla, a violent beast, but a skilled technician, a professional. Pippi has to follow guidelines, and there is a backup plan. And in fact, what happens is that Fuberta is found outside a restaurant. Pippi is going there to kill him, but finds Fuberta who's living in the restaurant. He's not expecting him to be armed because he's not trained that way. He's just a con man. But in fact, then he pulls out a gun, shoots at Pippi. Pippi shoots back, but a police car is coming by. They arrest him. But because he's followed the guidelines, dropping the gun, not opposing, not trying to escape or resist, pretending it was just self-defense, that he was shot at and responded, they bribe a judge, they bribe a juror, and he escapes the consequences, right? There is another episode where Crocifisso, Pippi's son, has to get money out of a mobster who owes 100,000. Goes there, the mobster pulls a gun on Cross, threatens to kill him. And Cross responds with charm and humor and deterrence. Mentions, you know whose son I am, who's my father, what the consequences will be, but handles that in a very... His leadership is made of confidence. And it's a short but interesting episode. And finally, there is the episode of the governor of Nevada, who goes to the hotel and the casino, and he's allowed to do whatever he wants there, because they want to cultivate the political connection. He has a daughter, Mercy, who gets into a relationship that is abusive, and finally she's killed by her partner, Theo, and the governor himself cannot have justice, cannot get justice, doesn't control the situation. Theo is able to escape the consequences, is not condemned to be executed, comes out with all sorts of legal excuses, is defended very well. So they go to the governor of Nevada and they say, would you be happier if Theo was killed? So that he cannot implicate himself. He's not saying, kill him for me. But they're helping him because the governor seems to be a powerful politician who could even become the president one day. And they're not doing it for a fee, for money. They're doing it to cultivate a relationship, to have social credit with this powerful individual. And then, of course, Puzo intervenes with this idea that criminals are criminals, but regular people are even worse, right? Look at somebody like Theo, who claimed to be a poet, ended up killing a woman. And a woman he loved, apparently, allegedly. And look at Walter, the governor. Not only he knows that the mafia will kill at his request, but he placed everything to his advantage. He'll go to Theo's funeral and express his forgiveness just to advance his political career. Everything is planned carefully, and as a result, Cross, Pippi's son, will become the little hammer, one of the killers, top killers in the family. The last example that is Machiavellian in the book that I included is the following. Virginio Ballazzo is closely connected to the Don, He's in control of New York City, not the Bronx, the city itself. There's some criminal business, mafia business there, and he's working with the Don. He starts collaborating with the FBI, so they need to protect the Don. How do they do that? First, they send him a message. Not a message that says, don't talk, don't report on your dealings with the Don, otherwise we'll kill you or kill your family. They send a message saying, we love you and we love your children even more. And he gets the oblique message, and influence is sufficient to control the situation in part. So Virgilio will not implicate the Don, will talk about other criminals. But then, once the trial is over, he's placed in the witness protection plan, they find him and they eliminate Virgilio and his wife. They use force because only force gives you complete control of the situation. At that point, Virgilio cannot go back on his decision to omit his collaborations with the Don. And it becomes an instrument of deterrence because this double homicide is a public punishment, so other people will be deterred from collaborating with the FBI. In the course of this homicide, Pippi employs Dante, the grandson of the Don, and Dante is not a Machiavellian, a good Machiavellian leader. He's really more of a savage criminal and a sadist, right? Takes pleasure in his work, is unnecessarily cruel. He's scary, even Pippi is scared of him. What is the Don's motivation? To restore order in his context, right? Enforcing the rules, bring back justice in that system. Putting aside personal emotions, the Don says, I didn't like anyone better than Virgilio. Right, of course. This was only business, just business. Let me show you briefly a scene. Since we've seen various meetings and the representation of mafia meetings, I'll show you the meeting that Michael has in the Vatican when he's trying to gain control of a company, a real estate company, controlled by the Vatican.